Salute! The Roman Spatha. This started life out primarily as a cavalry sword for the Roman military. However, in the 3rd century, it started to take over as the main infantry sword as well. And as you might imagine, a sword that starts out life as a cavalry weapon, it is very much a heavy weapon when it comes to cuts. It's got a very heavy blade, and this hilt lends itself to a strong hammer grip for those powerful swings, making it great for taking swings on horseback, and of course on the ground, delivering some pretty powerful blows to your opponents. And we know that the Roman military seems to have primarily focused on swings and cuts over thrusts because in the 5th century, the commentator Vegetius actually criticizes the Roman military for not incorporating thrust as much as he thinks they should. Now, to understand the nuances of Roman fencing and why they tend to be a little bit more on the cut focus, you gotta start with what their overall equipment looked like. The armor that I'm wearing here is, for the most part, pretty typical of the 4th century. There are a few errors, though, and feel free to note those mistakes. I have listed them on the screen. But for the most part, this is pretty typical of the 4th century. And you can see a lot of differences from the Romans of the 1st and 2nd centuries. Most notably is probably the shield being, instead of a large rectangular scutum, instead being a rounder shield, historically being typically a oval shape and a lenticular or dished shape rather than flat, but flat shields certainly did exist, especially in the auxiliaries. And this shield is a lot easier to swing a larger weapon around than the earlier scutum was, which means you can fight with different weapons than previously. The short sword was no longer something that you had to use. You could use much bigger weapons, and this was important because they are fighting very different opponents than they were in previous centuries. It is a new battlefield, it is a new game, and it requires new equipment. When fighting battles, the goal isn't to get touches or points or anything like that, and it's not even actually to unalive your enemy. It is actually specifically to neutralize the opponent, to neutralize the threat. And when it comes to fighting, take a second to think about what part of your body is the most exposed while simultaneously presenting the largest threat. It's your hand. This is something that is not a revelation to just about any swordsman, I'm sure. In fact, this idea is actually talked about quite heavily in one of the earlier manuscripts of medieval combat in Europe, MS 133, in which they tend to take a particular interest in hitting the opponent's hand. To quote Zim from Starship Troopers, or rather paraphrase him in a more medieval context, the enemy cannot swing a sword if you disable his hand. However, considering the hand is in fact a small moving object, it is something that is a little bit difficult to hit on that front, especially if you're trying to hit it with thrusts. It's a bit easier to hit it with a cut. Think about the difference between trying to poke a baseball out of the air with a bat versus just swinging at it. One is significantly easier than the other, so it makes sense that a fencing strategy based around cuts would be preferential in a world where a hand is a major and important target in warfare. And we do see examples of Roman armor actually trying to counter this a little bit, such as the mantica, but it seems to have largely phased out. Exactly why, it's difficult to say for sure, but its existence does indicate that cuts were pretty important throughout the Roman Empire's fencing strategy. Looking beyond the hand for other targets, it's pretty obvious that the armor of the time has a very difficult time covering up joints, primarily and most importantly, the base of the neck. And while you can certainly hit that with a thrust, it is going to be a lot easier to hit with a cut, and you do not need to go that deep. Vegetius argues that thrusts can go far deeper than a cut, but when it comes to the neck, you don't need to go that deep at all to do the damage necessary to neutralize the enemy or more. Putting all this together, it does make sense why the Romans may have preferred to focus on cuts in their fencing techniques over thrusts, even though thrusts become more important in later centuries. The shift towards thrusts in later centuries is probably due to a shift in the access and availability of armor, because throughout the early medieval period, chainmail seems to be primarily something worn by the elite and not something totally available to everyone else.